I Hello everybody. I'm on the Patriarchy podcast. This is officially number 14 with the Pragmatism of War, and I have my guest with me. It's the He's been on another episode. This is Robert, aka Robert, and he is an esteemed colleague of mine on them telegrams. Go ahead and introduce yourself, Robert.
Hello there. I'm Robert, also known as Ranger Marsh,
Oh, there we go.
protector of the Everglades.
I mean, you got to get them gators in.
I've got to protect them from the pythons and all the other invasive species.
Nobody likes a snake in the grass.
Even worse when it's a 10-foot snake that's in the water
I mean, and then
and
you
it's
got
eating
the
a gator.
oh, and then you got Hollywood all up in your grill in Florida when they make a movie like Anaconda.
Well, if they would come down and, let the anacondas eat them, I think we could have meet in the middle there.
Ugh, I mean, it's just too much Marxism for even the anacondas to handle.
They're snakes, but they're not fond of starving.
Good eating. I mean, that's the one thing war doesn't bring is not good eating. So that
Generally not. Has a tendency to destroy the capital stock. So yeah, very, very bad for capitalism. Very good for uh, communism, for Marxism. This was
yeah,
actually Stalin's analysis in the lead up to World War II, why he viewed a second imperialist war, as he called it, as very critical to the Soviet Union's ultimate goal of global communism.
I
Because
see.
he'd seen the results of World War One. Obviously, it took World War One to usher in the first Marxist state, in the Soviet Union, because the war had been so incredibly destructive.
Yeah, and in between that time period, you had obviously the Holodomor and then the other numerous ethnic cleansing tragedies slash famines that went on through that region. Well, most of those regions in Europe that just were back and forth. And really, I mean, there was in between World War One and World War Two, there were almost no time periods where there was settled peace. And
Yeah,
even
right.
after,
Because you went straight from World War One into the Russian Civil War, which a lot of people don't realize. But it depends on how you count it. These things are difficult to count. But the Russian Civil War was probably the third deadliest war of the 20th century. So you've got World War II, World War One, and then the Russian Civil War. So you go straight from the second deadliest war of the century straight into the third deadliest war of the century. Um, and it took place over large swaths of Eurasia, I guess you could say, spanning all the
hmm
way from Mongolia. You had stuff going on over there, even in Manchuria, Vladivostok, and then all the way across Siberia, and then a lot of stuff going on in the Baltic states, the British being involved up there in the Baltic Sea, and of course the whole Polish conflict, the Polish-Soviet War, which was kind of an outgrowth of this larger Russian Civil War, where the Russians almost get to Warsaw but are stopped kind of at the last moment by a Polish army and sort of one of these great turnarounds. And then the Finnish Civil War is kind of linked into that too, because you had reds and whites fighting there, and the whites win in Finland, unlike in Russia,
Woo!
and at least to some extent due to German assistance from German divisions that were kind of in that area and ended up helping um, Marshal Mannerheim and his forces defeat the Reds in Helsinki.
Yeah, I mean, and it spanned across almost all the top half of that portion of Europe, and it caused so much destruction in its wake. And I like even a couple months ago, whenever I heard about it, didn't realize on how much of an impact that it had on both the tie-in to World War One into World War Two into spreading that kind of various ideology, or it trying to spread that kind of various ideology all throughout Europe. And everybody likes to say, "Oh well, the Albanians, the Serbians, the Polish, and a few others spattered throughout that I probably forgot." All well, they succumbed to communism, and they're like, "Well, we had that backlash because of into fascism because of the Bolshevism and the communism." And what they don't understand, or they don't have I guess the propensity to understand that backlash did exist, sure, but was it for a way out against the communism, or a way into just kind of refashioning a communist dialectic within the state, just turning it into a more, well, I don't want to say a fashionable enterprise, but it sure as heck did centralize a lot, and a lot more so when it came to the state-led politics of the day. I guess a downstream from monarchy would probably be then the next closest one would probably be fascism versus a
Well, and this,
communist.
I think this ties in directly to our title here of the pragmatism of war. Um, this whole aspect of centralization
Mm-hmm.
and reactions to developments and stuff like that. And I mean, this is, yeah, a direct tie in here. And it bears mentioning real quick, I guess, while we were on the topic of the upheavals in Eastern Europe and reactions and stuff like that. I mean, we just touched on the Russian Civil War a little bit there, but there was so much else going on with the revolution in Bavaria, in Germany. You had a red Bavarian state that existed for a little while before it was put down by German veterans returning from World War One. Um, at the auspices of the Weimar government, which was a social democratic government. So again, this is kind of this deep split between sort of, I guess you'd call it communism proper, or Bolshevism, and social democracy, which goes all the way back to like the First International and Marx and his disagreement with certain people. But then you see that split grow in World War One, and like the decisions of the different decisions of the social democratic parties and like the hardliner parties, whether or not to support the war. And then the Bolshevik Menshevik divide in Russia that kind of blossoms on its own. But then this sort of like this betrayal, as it's viewed by the Marxists in Germany, where the Social Democrats put down the Spartacists in Bavaria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then but then you always had the obviously the tie-ins to communism killing off any kind of religious movement too. But the more interesting part about the Mensheviks, from what I understood, is obviously they were the old school traditionalists. They were the old school, the ones who wanted to maintain that order within, well, frankly, the church as interdependent to the state. And I know that Stalin, in a way, did want that because he was a Cossack, a Cossack, however you say it, and they had that very strong kind of Menshevik mentality, whereas the Bolsheviks wanted the more so opposite, which would be more so leading to the social democratic order or the democratic liberal order, as to have as to have religion put down by the state. And I lost him. Where'd he go? Oh, he's back now.
Oh,
Oh, see.
what happened?
Oh,
I was talking there, and then I
did a quick
and
did a
then
quick innie and another outie, but he's innie again.
I'm here. I'm here. Um, I was just gonna say real quick. Stalin was Georgian, actually. His name was Zhugashvili. That was actually
Oh,
his
he
real
was.
name.
Oh, that's
He was
right.
from Georgia. Yeah, yeah. So he, his Georgian was his first language, not Russian. He spoke Russian with a Georgian accent. And also, originally he was studying to be a priest. That's what his mother wanted him to
An
be.
Orthodox priest, because
Yeah,
he
he
was
was in the. Yep.
um, his mother was half. Was she half Jewish
No, I don't think so. I think
or
he was full Georgian.
full Georgian? Okay,
I'm pretty
I've
sure.
heard rumors that that obviously Stalin was But then again, that comes with almost every kind of European dictator. You get all
Yeah,
the
well, there's a theory for that for everybody, I guess,
right,
basically.
right.
Um,
But the interesting part is that he was so tied into that traditions of the old ways that he had that mentality. Obviously, he had a very steel kind of mentality, but he didn't apply it to the religion or a
uh,
he tied
yeah,
it
I
to
mean,
the state.
he was definitely a doctrinaire atheist. I mean, by the time the Bolsheviks took power, I mean, his sort of compromise with the church is not something he like was. I don't think it was something he was into. He was a real dedicated communist. It's just the again the pragmatism of war. You know, it kind of led to this sort of obvious conclusion that, well, Marxist Leninism is not something that the common people of Russia are willing to fight a horrific war of sacrifice and die for
Hmm.
en masse,
Yeah.
right? But these old forces of nationalism, religion, patriotism, people will fight and die for those. And so they sort of like wander them in a little bit through Marxist Leninism.
And the interesting part about this is you can even tie this back to the monarchies, especially the monarchies in Europe. There's that sense of that purpose, that pride. Yeah, you don't even necessarily need to have. Well, I guess obviously Christendom would be a huge influence in all of that, but you can even go back to like the pagans and their tribes, and what the how the Vikings conquered. Well, I mean, the majority of the known world at the time as to how much they expanded their basically nomadic empire. The same as the Mongols. They didn't really have a quote unquote state religion. Well, and I guess the biggest one would probably be the Roman or the Persian empires. I guess those would be the two closest ones that actually had like some sense of a formalized, ritualistic style, stylized religion that had that those traditional aspects attached to it. Obviously that people or men like Avola mused with and Ganon, but then you go on to the point where you have that mentality, as the Romans kind of put that more in a formalized aspect. I mean, you had Caesar, who was literally an emperor or a monarch, and they always said, for duty, for country, for Rome, right? And they had that code amongst themselves, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, but they had that sense of, there's not only we're doing this for us, but we're doing this for our homeland. So there's not only a religious aspect to it because you could literally believe that the emperor was God incarnate, or you're doing it for your family, which is a very instinctual, pragmatic approach to, you know, seizing more land for the empire. Hello? Uh oh. He did it again. He keeps popping in and out. He's like uh he's like the pizza delivery guy. Maybe he's got to get a pizza. I'm not sure. It's going to be a short podcast. It's going to be a long podcast. It, he's there. Uh oh. Maybe this will be a two-parter. I'm gonna mute my mic for a second. So anyway, I guess I was saying more so about like that pragmatism. That pragmatism is there, um, but it is important to note that it keeps it keeps it keeps going. You know that it is just as dependent upon us as it is dependent upon the state. But hold on, there's some technical difficulties, so I gotta come back, put the microphone on mute for a minute, and figure it out from there.
Hello.
And we're back,
And we're back.
and it was over, but we're back.
It's
we
so
keep
over.
we keep getting memed.
It's so back.
Stop the madness.
We're
Oh, shenanigans. There we go.
oh my goodness.
It's there.
I don't know why it hates me so much.
It just keeps your Wi-Fi password isn't strong enough.
I guess, or something. I mean, yeah.
The pragmatism of the StreamYard stream powered by ducks. The ducks need to run faster.
I need to whip them into shape.
You got you got to go Stalin on them.
Give them some duck exercise. Oh, I just quack myself up sometimes.
That's a good one. I'll give point.
You didn't expect that when you billed me for tonight, did you?
You quack me up.
If only these ducks would learn how to work their way on the World Wide Web. You think it would be easy for them, but oh,
It's a life's a pond. You got to swim in it.
it's truer words have never been spoken. Boy, so where's a good place to pick up?
I was
I did want to mention with the Eastern, we could just touch on with Eastern Europe, in the interwar period, you also have a Marxist revolution in Hungary, Bela Kun, and that's around for about a year before he gets chased out of town because people are starting to starve. And then the kind of the Horthy regime comes in the aftermath of that. But yeah, so you had a lot of stuff going on, and that whole borderland was not peaceful, and lots of different groups in this sort of very unsettled area oppressing each other, especially with the precedent that kind of Versailles set with if you have the majority population in an area, you get the land. So that leads to like a lot of bad incentives, I guess you could say, what that leads to, aka ethnic cleansing. And that kind of creates a precedent which goes right up through the aftermath of World War II. And and even like into the Yugoslav wars in the 90s.
Yeah. But I mean, even if you think about it too, like even when you go back as far as monarchies, in a way, were very ethnically centered. Most of them were throughout time. But then you even go through like the split of the Roman Empire when it split into the Eastern Roman Empire. That was in a sense kind of an informal, I guess. I mean, and the best way I could think to compare it to is like a Treaty of Versailles, because you had the empire split itself almost entirely in half in two. But in order for the other part of the empire to survive, it had to be that way. And I know they didn't set up a treaty, and I know that part of it was due to just absolute, survival and um, retaining and maintaining a structure of an empire which was kind of a shadow of its former self and its former glory of Rome. But the fact that it had to survive like that, they had to. I mean, they had to ethnically cleanse. They had to maintain order that way, even in the Eastern even in the Eastern Byzantine Empire, because of how tenuous it became. And that Treaty of Versailles was, well, Christianity. I mean, people weren't basically allowed into the empire if they weren't Christians in some in some respect. So it did have a definite pragmatism to that that kind of mentality. And they obviously still saw their emperor as ordained by God, and of course their patriarchs, ordained by God. But they didn't see it in a way that most monarchies saw it up to that point, right? They kind of stopped that nonsense of as to where, oh well, the gods ordained the Caesar. No, that's not how it works anymore, right? So we don't have they kind of stopped that mentality, and I guess in a way, I'm not accusing obviously, the Orthodox to start that kind of liberal mentality of like, well, this is a leader, but we don't have to exactly agree with him because he's not completely ordained by God or not commanded by the gods to completely agree with him. I would obviously that has this whole gamut of issues with that right away, but it became less of that mentality, right? So there was less of that mentality, and it became a more, what is our leader going to do for us? What is the pragmatism behind the purpose of our leaders? Are they just here for our, well, for them to rule over us in their divinity, in their divine, well, very Warhammer like, but in their divine being, or are they here to help us in order to be in, what's the word I'm looking for, coexistence with? Are they seeing us as equals? Are they here for us so we can all, well, basically survive and function as a society?
Yeah, and well, that's so, I mean, that's part of what you end up with in like the interwar period is in the aftermath of World War One, the monarchies of Europe look very weak and feckless. I mean, on the one hand, you have, oh my goodness, I mean, four monarchies, at least three monarchies, you could say, and really kind of four that just are evaporate, in the aftermath of the war, during the war, the course of the war, that are just gone. Um, and one falling to um, Bolsheviks, one to Social Democrats, one to various petty ethnic nationalities or nationalisms, and the other, debatably was already gone before the war. Basically, in the case of the Ottoman Empire, because you already had the Young Turks kind of overthrow the government prior to World War One, so it was kind of already a figurehead position that was on its way out. But um, so like in that sort of period, people are looking for something that can stop Bolshevism, and most people are not really looking at monarchy. It's not something that people have much faith in being able to stop it. I mean, even in the case of some of the countries that take a more, I guess, a route that looks more to the past, in Europe, maybe countries like Austria before the Nazi takeover under Adolphus. It's not like he invited the Habsburgs back, really. Also, in the case of Portugal, you get sort of this new sort of thing. People describe it as like a corporatist or integralist state, sort of maybe pseudo-fascist, you might call it, but not the camp sort of fascism of like Mussolini or something. Very sort of pragmatic, technocratic government. I think they still had a monarchy. I can't recall off the top of my head because Portugal had had a revolution, and then the Estado Novo took over. I guess they reinstated the monarchy, but the monarchy was not really doing anything. If they were around, it was just a figurehead. And I mean, that's the same thing you basically had happen in Spain, right? With the Spanish Civil War and the nationalists winning. I mean, they were monarchs.
Yeah, because then you had Franco, who just completely became. Well, I mean, he became a better version of Mussolini. Uh oh. Again? Hello?
I'm
Hello?
here.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me?
Okay, there you are.
Boy, that was unfortunate. No, I mean, even the Italians still had the king. Victor Emmanuel was still king during all of Mussolini's reign. I mean, he's the guy who ended up negotiating with the Allies during World War II to bring Italy out of the war, switch sides, whatever. And there was a king in Spain too, that the nationalists were, there to back, but they weren't running anything. So
Yeah, but Spain smartly never got involved with anybody's business but their own. Because they always had, they, they were basically kind of like how the Greeks had to deal with the Turks. Spain was always getting invaded by Moors, so they always had to deal with that instead of being worried about Europe's other problems. Whereas obviously the Greeks got involved in both wars, but unwittingly, like they didn't really want to in either war.
well, yeah, they were kind of the pawns in other people's game, basically. I mean, because that's kind of the unfortunate reality of the Greek state and sort of the new Greek state after its independence from the Ottomans. It was kind of a result of like British meddling in the Ottoman Empire, and so they were always kind of dependent on the British, for better or worse, or on some sort of patron. You sort of had this conflict in World War One versus people in Greece who wanted the patronage of the Germans versus the patronage of the British. And then in World War II, of course, they were totally on the British side of things, especially because you had Mussolini, who was a hungry boy,
Yeah,
wanted to nom all that sweet Roman Empire land.
yeah, he really like. Then there's the like the nod back to somebody like Avola. Yeah, I guess in a lot of ways.
Ebola.
Yeah, I mean Mussolini in a lot of
It's
ways
in the '90s.
is the no Evola, not
Mm.
not the Ebola virus.
Oh, okay. That's weird.
The Ebola virus, on the other hand, is a whole different topic for pragmatism, but it's still viruses in general could be pragmatic, but they aren't corona.
As long as it doesn't make you bleed out of your eyeballs.
I mean, I haven't watched any movies lately, but I'm pretty sure that's from a movie.
Probably. Um. So, anyways, yeah, I guess we're talking about. Well, the thing with Spain too was, they were just so devastated after the Civil War. They weren't really in a state to get involved with anyone. Franco, like Hitler's reaching out to him about, getting involved in the war, and Franco's like, okay, here's all this stuff I need. I need you to like arm my entire army. Also, I need a ton of oil. Oh, you guys don't have enough oil for your own army? Oh, sorry. Well, we can't get involved. Smart move. But so I
I'm
guess,
pretty sure by that the text messages ended by that point.
yeah, Hitler was not a fan. He was not really fond of Franco. They didn't get along very well.
I mean, even Mussolini thought he was insane, and Mussolini himself was insane.
Yeah, Mussolini was a funny boy. Yeah, he had a quite the career.
Very charismatic, though.
His
Extremely.
dad, I mean, pictures I've seen of his dad, he looks like the most generic Italian man ever. Like it's like if somebody said like draw Mario as a 19th century, late 19th century person. Oh, okay.
It's the mustache.
Yeah, it really is the mustache. It really, it's like, do you have to be leaning into the stereotypes that hard, sir? Um,
Well, I mean, when you're making a video game based on an Italian plumber made by Asian engineers, you have to lean into stereotypes.
it's true. I guess that's the only exposure to Italian people that they would have had.
It kind of makes perfect sense. I mean, there's a pragmatism to Mario too. Like he basically had to do what he had to do to help his kingdom.
Well, he is a plumber. I mean, they're very pragmatic people.
Very okay. I mean,
You
he
know,
did learn a trade after all. He didn't
it's
go into the
true.
restaurant business. So,
He went to trade school. He
yep,
was very much a pragmatist.
yep. It's
Um,
bingo.
well, yeah. So I guess kind of into that pragmatism thing. I know we were talking about sort of in the lead up about um, Stalin and sort of Stalin's approach to sort of the lead up to World War II, because
Hmm.
he had kind of realized, I think, as a lot of the Bolsheviks did, and a lot of observers did, that it was World War One, the cataclysm that was unleashed by the war, that provided the impetus for the communist takeover of the Soviet Union. You know, you hadn't had a successful communist revolution before that point. I mean, heck, you even look at the Paris Commune in 1870. That took place in the context of the Franco-Prussian War, right? So again, you sort of have this cataclysm of war leading to social unrest and upheaval, and then a revolution from it. Of course, it was put down by the French army, but in the case of Russia, you know, they had the Russian Civil War, but I mean, it was not very long into it that the Bolsheviks had the upper hand. So Stalin, you know, he's looking at the situation in the interwar period, and he wants global revolution. He wants global communism, and he realizes, okay, well, what we need is round two. You know, we need the second
Yeah,
imperialist war,
yeah.
as they kind of use the terminology. We need the imperialists, as they call the, or the capitalist states, to go to war with each other, have a cataclysmic war, and then we'll have sort of revolution all over again. So that's kind of what they're gearing up for. In the lead up to World War II, which is why you see, you know, these massive armaments productions. Um, and it doesn't quite turn out how he wanted it to. Like at first, it goes better than he could have hoped, because he gets exactly what he wants, which is a war between Germany and Britain and France. But then Germany defeats France way too fast, which nobody expected on either side, by and large. Um, and that kind of upturns his plans because he wasn't really ready on the sort of timetable that he was presented with now. He had, as everybody had, he thought that the war between Germany and France was going to drag out for at least a year or two, because of how much it had dragged out in World War One. You know, in
Yeah.
World War One, it was Russia that had gone down pretty hard um, in during the war. Um,
I mean,
but
even in the middle of that, well, more so the tail end of World War One, they had a bloody revolution on top of it.
Right. And that's something people don't realize is um like yeah, how the Russians were doing fairly well in the war until the point of the revolution, and you just kind of had a disintegration of the army is what happened. The Bolsheviks specifically targeted the army for propaganda. Their plan, and this is why they ended up being so effective, was to take over the army first as sort of like the first institution to infiltrate,
Mm-hmm.
and then go from there, which was smart because a big problem with Russia was you didn't have it wasn't like the United States where you had a large middle class and you didn't have the sort of what went along with that, all the intermediate institutions. You had the state, you had the church, which was very much tied up with the state.
Mm-hmm.
But then the institution by which the state interfaced with the people was pretty much just the army. And there was the monarchy. And that is part of why it was such a disaster for Nicholas to abdicate, was because um, the monarchy was so crucial to like the relationship between the state, the Russian state, and the people. And then the only other institution that really was an effective interface between the state and the people was the army, because
Yep.
it was the institution through which the common people were in the state, right? The common soldier, he was a peasant. But also, the army was responsible for so much of Russia's internal policing. Like any sort of, I don't mean this in a derogatory sense because it was a rapidly developing country in the lead up to World War One. But as any sort of developing, or we might say third world country does nowadays, like they have large armies, and a lot of what they do is internal policing, um, because there's a lot of that needs to be done in sort of a developing country like that. So when you lose the monarchy, and then you lose the army to the Bolsheviks, there's not much left in the way of social institutions that can hold up that tide. And what institutions there were did fight back, and it took the Bolsheviks until I think 1922 is the official end of the Russian Civil War. It's starting, right in 1917, pretty much after the October Revolution. It's go time. So it took them that long to sort of calm things down. And even then, sort of this is, sort of the modern thesis of what was going on with what's commonly called like the Holodomor, or the probably a better, more technical term would be Stalin's collectivization program.
Oh yeah, with the NKVD and all the just
Well, just trying to get everybody on collective farms, right?
yeah.
Is what he was doing. Because what had happened up to that point, when Stalin kind of starts that program, he takes power fully in like 1928 and begins the collectivization. Sort of what had happened in end of the Russian Civil War in like 22, right? Is the Bolsheviks had called a truce with the people,
Okay.
because the Bolsheviks had wrecked the country. They deindustrialized Russia. It annihilated the capital stock, the Civil War, and the way that the Bolsheviks prosecuted it, which was to do crazy stuff like abolish money in exchange on penalty of death. Like if you were
Hmm.
buying and selling goods like a normal human being, you would be shot, sort of thing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then basically their program was just looting the country.
Which
So
gave birth to like the KGB and the Stasi.
yeah. I mean, in the early days, it was in some ways even worse because it was just like mass chaos, just
Yeah.
like anarchy, like armed bands who were
And
given
you
the
could
authority to just do whatever
yeah,
they wanted.
and you could definitely say this is where Orwell got his concept of Big Brother, and all of that came about because of this influence for sure.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, he had that experience directly, and in his case from Spain when he was in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, fighting with the communists. Of course, taught him a lesson the hard way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so you kind of had what at the end of sort of the Civil War, the Bolsheviks basically called the truce with the peasants. By Lenin, Lenin introduced the new economic policy, the NEP, which was just okay. Maybe full communism is not a good idea. We'll just chillax and let sort of normal market exchanges happen so that everyone is not starving to death. And you sort of had this situation where the Bolsheviks were in power in the urban centers, but in the rural areas, in the hinterlands, the peasants, they kind of just got to live their lives as they had. There was a lot of land redistribution, you might say, that had taken place during the Civil War that was now kind of just in place, where, I mean, the nobility was basically gone, right? They had
Yeah.
been killed or fled the country.
I mean, this is, and the weird part about this is a lot of this stuff kind of does mirror the original 13 colonies and what happened as well. I mean, not in the communistic aspect of it, but this does mirror what happened during the American Revolution as well.
Well, it's even more like the French Revolution,
Well,
where, I mean, you had like the immigrants, right? You had the nobility just picked up and left France. And of course, they came back because the whole revolution thing didn't last quite as long.
wait,
It wasn't
which
75 years.
revolution?
Well, yeah, the OG, I guess, the 89 vintage revolution, they were back, and Napoleon invited a lot of them back. So, they were all back. A lot of them were back in less than 2 decades. But in the case of the Russian Revolution, you had a government that was even even more maniacal,
Mhm.
which mellowed out
Yeah.
much more slowly, and was still in effect, 75 years
Yeah, and the French always kind of
almost.
had that adaptation of both kind of a hybrid of Germanic and Anglo kind of monarchical structure. They kind of borrowed from both, so it definitely gave them more so of a structure than Russia ever pretty much probably ever had.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely. I guess I'd have to like look at it more, but I guess they might have had a bit more of a middle class, and probably not. But I mean, there's a lot of parallels there, and I think part of the reason why the French and Russian revolutions are as similar as they are is because you sort of had that same sort of lack of a middle class, but there were probably more intermediate institutions in the case of France because this whole centralization was a bit more new in their case. Like France
Yeah,
had been a very decentralized country for a very long time until Louis the 16th, or Louis the 14th, who was Louis the 16th's grandfather. So, it was just in his grandfather, or maybe his great grandfather. I forget. I'm pretty sure it was his grandfather.
it's a dad, but that was
Yeah, yeah, one of his. Anyways, it was in his grandfather's time that the French state had become very centralized, and a little bit in the lead up to that with Richelieu and stuff. So I guess it was a somewhat more recent phenomenon, and there were still a lot of. That's why you had things like the Vendée in France, where you had this whole region of France that was able to put up some pretty stiff resistance, and you had that in Russia too, with like stuff like the Don Cossacks and stuff like that. I mean,
hmm
some of it's just the technological differences, right? Like railroads make centralization way easier. Um, but anyway, so you had this sort of in the 20s, you had this truce between the Bolsheviks in the cities and the peasants in the rural countryside, and Stalin put an end to that. And so his collectivization was really just the process of integrating the rural areas into the Bolshevik power structure, because he couldn't just let it stay in this sort of uncomfortable middle ground, right? This uncomfortable truce, because um, if they didn't have the economic power, if they didn't have collectivization in the countryside, they were undermining their own political power, and so
Ah, okay.
they
Yeah.
had to introduce full communism into the countryside.
Well, and then it makes you think too, because of how kind of hypocritical that revolution really was, because of the fact that they want to instill something like that as a way to pacify the people from revolting against them, just to thinking like, oh well, we're going to just instill this equality factor, or try to bring some kind of equilibrium for nobody to kind of outpace each other or outgain each other, because we're so afraid of things getting top heavy. But at the same time, when you don't have a thriving class of people and they get angry, and they're obviously going, if they're starving, they're going to be even angrier. And then you have it you you're really like cut you're you're cutting off your own hand that you're supposed to be harvesting with. Like you're not really making any sense, or making do with what you have. It's more so there is, like, to a point that that irony is totally unpragmatic, because then the fact that revolution is going to happen again and on a continuous basis until something else better comes along, or somebody develops a system that is going to get better. Because until then, I mean, as we have it here in the United States, people, we've become so prosperous that people are like, oh well, then we have to, then they want to revert to something like that Marxist dialectic, or go into some crazy left field, well,
Well,
crypto fascism, right?
that's Schumpeter's argument, right? Is that
Yeah,
capitalism is so productive that it creates this sort of
communist.
whole well, yeah, it creates an entire like useless eater class of academics and bureaucrats who just sit
Yeah.
around and like fantasize about taking power because they don't actually need to do anything productive because capitalism is so productive.
Yeah, it's the
Right.
automatons. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
and so this class sort of creates the conditions for communism. Yeah, that's Schumpeter's argument. It's just pretty convincing. At least, it definitely seems to be playing out. Um,
Yeah, and I
yeah,
mean, obviously, you have the classic college kid who thinks, oh well, everybody's got to be equal, and they're like, oh, more capitalism. They're all hemming and hawing, and they come out of school with debt and such. And then like we mentioned earlier with Super Mario, who's the plumber, who goes into a 4 to 6 year journeyman program and comes out making buco bucks, if especially if they keep it together throughout that time period, learn the trade, and they become productive members of society. Who
yep.
could make upwards of, probably, if they're really successful, they could make over, six figures. Is just as much of a doctor, right?
It
And
depends on how many coins they pick up when they jump into those blocks.
well, and then on the flip side, they can be either, pizza delivery guys, or turtle salesmen on the side, right?
Yeah, and they get the princess as long as they eat the right mushrooms.
Oh. All right, Joe Rogan, no
Oh,
DMT here.
well, anyways, enough about DMT. I guess
Love it. That was great. Oh man, that turnaround was beautiful. God, that was
um,
beautiful.
did we want to jump in? I guess a little bit to like sort of the meat of like the thesis, the World War II thesis, I guess.
I mean, we've been talking about people starving so much. We might as well get into some meat.
Yeah. So I guess sort of the thing we talked about some in like the thesis I teased you, but not really dug into very much, was sort of this idea, right? Just looking at things from like a strictly pragmatic or material analysis. Um, we were talking about beforehand that I don't find ideological analyses of history very interesting. Not that there's not merit to them. I'm sure there is, and I'm not saying that there isn't. I just find the material analysis more interesting personally. And it's much I feel like it's much more productive to discuss
Right.
too, because there's
Yeah.
less like subjectivism and finger pointing, and it's more about, okay, can we think about logically sort of what would have happened here, that those sorts of questions, right? A little more crunchy, I guess. So kind of looking at things that way, I sort of wanted to analyze this question. You have a lot of people on the sort of outer right, I guess you would say, who kind of look
Hmm.
back to World War II. And, you know, World War II kind of is our current system sort of founding myth, right, of the current world order. It makes a lot of sense that people would look back to World War II as very important, because it is kind of this origin story of the order that we live in today.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
It's well
our certainly
established.
our ruling elite looks at it that way, and uses it in that way. And it's also used that way, in very interestingly, in Russia, but in a very different way. Like
Hmm.
it's also just as important, but in a different way. But and even in like Britain and Germany, you know, it's also used as their sort of founding stories, but also in different ways. Like Britain has the whole finest hour myth, like, you know, losing our empire was good because we were awesome in World War II sort of thing. And
I
Germany has
mean,
the whole sort of, we were so evil, but we've expunged the evil from ourselves, and we are this
yeah.
new
Yeah.
redeemed society sort of thing, right?
Whoopsie.
Yeah, yeah. So lots of different stories, but everybody in China actually, World War II is very, very crucial to them as well. Although they probably, funnily enough, I mean, China is probably the country that lies the most about World War II.
And
Um, but,
they could have dominated everybody just based on their population. I mean, they could have just flooded other countries.
oh well, yeah. I mean, they were getting trashed by Japan, though. I mean, it was if it hadn't been for the U.S. beating Japan off their backs, they would have been Japanese slaves, basically.
They're always angry. Japanese are just always just angry about something.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
they're
they're always
just pissed.
angry about being next to China, I guess.
I mean, they're always there. The Chinese and the Japanese are always
I
there.
mean, maybe if you lived right next to China, you would be upset too. I don't know.
Why I mean, why would
Um,
they, why would they not be?
but so, anyways, yeah, and that would be interesting. It would be to talk about China and China's approach to World War II and sort of the myths of China and World War II. Because the thing is, like, people in the West don't even realize how twisted the Chinese view on World War II is, because people in the West have like no conception of what World War II in China even was. Like, people have no idea that the country that had the second highest number of casualties in World War II was China. It's
Oh,
just like
really? I
people are
didn't
like,
know that.
yeah, exactly. It was Soviet Union number one, and then China. 20 about 10 to 20 million people died in China, mostly civilians. Um, and on top of that, you also had the largest mass migration of people in human history,
Hmm.
um, up to that point at least, taking place in China during the war, because of people fleeing from the Japanese offensives. Um, just tens of millions of people all picking up and moving.
Another reason why communism developed in China as swiftly as it did because of
E-
that, because of one of those.
exactly.
Yep.
Yep, you're dead on. Right. Again, what do we see? Social upheaval,
Yep.
mass social upheaval, the complete destruction of the social structure. Um, it's really interesting. Yeah, somebody, one historian I was listening to a lecture on this on was talking about how basically the traditional Chinese social structure, like their whole sort of filial system of inheritance and
Hmm.
respect for elders and all that sort of stuff, like it was literally destroyed. Like it could not survive World War II because of how
Wow.
devastating it was. Like their entire social structure was upended in like an almost like a zombie apocalypse way because everything was so chaotic. Like you gotta another thing to realize is for China, World War II started in 1937,
Dang.
right? So it started 2 years before it did for everybody else in Europe. So they had been going for 8 years by the time the war ended. And the war in Asia ended like months after the war in Europe. So it was bad.
That's
Um,
intense. That's
yeah,
insane.
so that would be a great topic too, but especially to talk, it's sort of like in the context of like U.S. China relations or something like
Yeah.
that. But anyway, sort of back to the main topic. Yeah, so there's a lot of people on like the outer right, the far right. They sort of also look at World War II as sort of this pivotal point, and of course it was. Obviously, you can't say that it wasn't. It definitely did shape the world that we're in, like basically no other event in the last 100 years has. I mean, unless you want to say World War One, since it was the sort of impetus for World War II. Um, but definitely the proximate cause of the current world order. The thing is, they have this tendency to sort of flip it on its head um, a little simplistically. And they were like, oh, you see this a lot in those kind of circles where there's like, oh, those um, guys in World War II, if they could see how things were today, they would have realized they were fighting on the wrong side or something like that, right?
The meme. Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yes. Yeah,
Yes.
you see some sort of message to some extent of like that sort of sentiment a lot.
Yeah. Right.
And it's sort of an interesting, like impossible to realistically imagine, but still like useful to dig into hypothetical, right? Of like, okay, so what would actually be the result of if you want to say that the wrong side won, right? What would actually have been the real results of the other side winning, right?
Right.
Of a Nazi
Axis.
victory in Europe,
Yeah,
right?
Axis victory. Yep.
So, I mean, the thing is, this is where I think it's interesting to sort of have this pragmatic material analysis. Because what would it mean for Germany to have won in World War II? It was not going to mean Germany crossing the Atlantic and invading the United States.
No, no.
Because
We would have nuked them.
right. It's not some sort of like man in the high tower scenario,
Oh yeah. Okay.
because they couldn't even the Germans couldn't even cross the English Channel. Like that's the thing. Like there was never even the British like to play up like the whole Battle of Britain thing to be like, oh yeah, we were right on the edge and we held out. We were about to be invaded. All this stuff. There was never any chance that the Germans were going to be able to invade Great Britain because they'd lost like doggone like almost half their navy, either destroyed or badly damaged in the Norwegian campaign in 1940, Operation Weserübung, where they pulled this like night march or night sail, I guess would be the more proper term, on the Royal Navy and snuck like all these ships up into Norway. Worked great because they landed a bunch of troops before the British knew what was going on and sort of took out big chunks of Norway in this coup de main.
Yeah.
But in the process, they lost like 10 destroyers, a heavy cruiser, at least one heavy cruiser, maybe two, a couple light cruisers, big chunk of their navy, which was small to begin with. Even if they managed somehow to gain air superiority over Britain, which aircraft production numbers did not look favorable for them to do, especially with the fact that the U.S. was not keen on seeing Britain fall. It was already a big deal in the U.S. that France had fallen, because sort of the U.S.'s security strategy involved, okay, we don't want to fight a European war, so Britain and France are just going to be our buffers, And so France falling as quickly as it did, which nobody on either side expected, was already quite the overturning of U.S. national security strategy. Um, so they were definitely not keen on seeing the British fall, and they were already like in um, before the U.S. was involved in the war. They were already shipping in high octane fuel, which the Germans did not have access to, and they were shipping that to Britain, so that British fighter planes had this big edge over the Germans um, from the U.S. oil industry, which was the largest and most technically advanced in the world by far. But even if the Germans had gained air superiority, I mean, what were they going to do in the English Channel? Like the British would put the entire Royal Navy in the English Channel and like just literally kamikaze it into
Yeah,
the Germans before they let the Germans start landing like Panzer divisions on on
which was
British soil or
which
something.
was really the land strength was really the German strength was the
Exactly.
the foot soldiers and the tanks. I mean, that
Right.
was their backbone of their army.
Mm-hmm. And so German victory wasn't even going to involve taking Britain. That was a far cry from happening. It would have basically been a successful campaign in Russia, and that's why you see Hitler make this turn to the east
Barbarossa.
before Britain is knocked out of the war.
Yep.
Because he knew this too. People nowadays, and a lot of this, of course, is the British liking to sort of play up this finest hour myth. Right. They, and this is again where all sort of countries have this false narrative of the war, right? They like to play up this finest hour myth, so it gives this impression that things were like a lot closer than they were. So it befuddles a lot of people why
hmm
Hitler would turn east. But it totally makes sense because he didn't have the capability of knocking Britain out of the war. Not just because he couldn't cross the channel, but because Britain also had the resources of a global empire that Germany was.
Germany didn't have. Yeah.
Right. Germany didn't have that global empire. He didn't have the United States backing him up across the Atlantic. His capability of even choking Britain off from the resources of that global empire via like the U-boat campaign was pretty limited. The Germans did better with the U-boat campaign in World War One than in World War Two.
Mm.
A lot of that is because the Germans had a really big navy before World War One, and then before World War Two, stuff like the Treaty of Versailles had worked, so their navy was pretty small up to that point.
But that's just it. Where it's like, I mean, first off, Operation Barbarossa was probably one of the most catastrophic operations ever pulled. They do say in military history, and on top of it, it's funnily enough named after a hopefully resurrected king of Germany. So
Right,
this is
Frederick.
where that whole monarchical order or will to power of fascism comes into play because if he's going to name a little offensive or campaign or part of the campaign, I guess I don't know how you would classify it as, but he literally wanted to resurrect an old order looking towards his Lebensraum, which was racially motivated. And people who deny that and who want to deny that sort of pragmatism towards his ideology are completely off base. Whereas obviously the West, the Great Britain and American West are more so ideologically minded than they were, establishing. They don't want to mess with any of the nation states of Europe. Like it was what it was in Europe, right? So they don't want to do anything of that. And when people say or post those memes that are like, well, this could have been a different story with such and such something or other being posted, right? And we're not, getting into the particulars of that is a completely different conversation and a ridiculous one at that. But it's to the point where you don't see. Do you see how like the fact that people don't understand and how those ideologies mirror each other, but yet they can take everything and flip it on its head and say, well, American Democrats and American Republicans are basically the same thing. Well, you can't see this for something like a National Socialism versus Bolshevism, like you don't see on how those ideologies mirror each other at all, because they do, and that's just it. There's no pragmatic approach to that analysis.
Yeah, and I mean, you can definitely see that there was, I mean, Germany's war in the East was certainly racialized and exterminationist, like in a way that other aspects of the war were not. But you can definitely see threads of that racialized aspect and even exterminationist aspect in all the combatants of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the Western Allies certainly had a bit of that going on as well. There's sort of this tendency on like the two sides, right, to either paint the Anglo-Americans as like crusading angels, or to say like, oh, they were, depending on how much of an argument you're trying to make, they were just as bad or even worse, right, than say Nazi Germany in this aspect. But I mean, clearly it's clear that those threads were there, and but they were not quite as fully carried out, I guess, as Germany did in the East. And I mean, to be clear, like if you're just looking at things from like a purely amoral perspective, like things like that Germany was planning, like General Plan Ost, makes kind of sense. They were looking at this as like a struggle for resources, right?
Mm-hmm.
A struggle for living space for their people. So if you're just completely devoid of morality, doing things like sending most of the population of Western Russia, like 30 million people or whatever, into Siberia to starve to death, so then you can take their land and their resources and then enslave whoever's left to be like your serf class. I mean, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's basically like what people like the Mongols did, in large parts of Central Asia. So, I mean, it's certainly logical in sort of a way that's devoid of human morality. But anyways, just kind of leaving that aside, like any sort of value judgment, if you just sort of played out a scenario where Germany was able to somehow establish some sort of victory over the Soviet Union, which would have required what they were planning on, which was some sort of state collapse, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some sort of situation like, I don't know, Stalin has a pulmonary embolism and just drops dead, and there's no one capable of running the Soviet ship of state, and so you sort of just have this crumbling or something like that, a situation where they're able to establish, because their goals were pretty wildly unrealistic. Like their idea was like, okay, we're going to the Archangelsk to Astrakhan line, the AA line as they call it, which was just a straight line drawn between two cities, Archangelsk in the north and Astrakhan in the south. And Astrakhan is like hundreds of miles east of Stalingrad. That's how far some of these places were. And we're just going to go there, and by the time we get there, Russia will be gone, and we can just do whatever we want. So, looking at what would have actually sort of happened in this scenario if Germany was able to establish sort of this colonial government over Russia, incorporate its resources, kill or enslave its people, and sort of build out this. Basically, what they were trying to do was to create sort of a mirror image of the United States. Mm-hmm. And Hitler is very interested. He's very, just like the Soviets were, very fascinated by the United States. You had the Soviets like brought in these engineers from like Detroit and sort of the heartland of American industry to help them build these mega factories in the Soviet Union, because that was sort of the model they were looking at. Everybody wanted like this American wealth and industrialization. And for the Soviets, it was, sort of copying these American production models, but applying them in their minds and better through central planning. And then in the Nazi idea, it was claiming this wide, massive, empty territory, and then exploiting its resources.
Which
That
is
was
still pragmatically centrally planned, because what they would do with the resources is they would bring it back in
right.
that process.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, yeah, they were very much everybody there kind of thought that central planning would be more efficient than just market economy. So that was definitely something they shared in common. But so in this situation, you have sort of these continental super states. Like, what's the situation that you end up with then in, say, like the mid 40s, like where U.S. intervention, say, hasn't happened, but Germany has managed to establish some sort of control over Russia somehow, at least the western part of it. I mean, you basically at that point got a Cold War scenario because there's no way on Earth, even at that point, with all those resources, that Germany is going to be able to traipse across the Atlantic. Especially when you got to put in context of remembering what the United States did in the 1940s with naval construction, just in the interests of fighting a war with Japan. And the United States was probably correctly, at least at first, but it quickly changed when Russia started to go very badly. But was at first more concerned about Germany because Germany's industrial potential was so much greater than Japan's. And a Germany that has suddenly the resources of Western Russia and the Caucasus, Ukraine, all that stuff, the food, the oil, the coal of the Donbass, all that stuff. And it suddenly has all this that they can add, and like they've got the raw materials to add to their industrial base. That's a adversary that the United States is very concerned about. So basically, you almost have like these two sort of states squaring off with each other, right? United States and then a Germany, which almost has is almost similar to what you would have seen with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact during the Cold War, right? Because during the Cold War, you had a Soviet Union which basically ran from, Eastern Germany, like from the Elbe, all the way through Eastern Europe to Russia. Whereas in this case, you would have had a Germany, which was controlling everything from
Germany all the way,
Brittany in France, all the way up to, say, the Urals in Russia. So they've got Western Europe, but they don't have Eastern Russia. But you would have had a similar sort of power potential there. And, Western Russia would have been as wrecked or more wrecked than it was in reality, and probably more wrecked than Eastern and Central Europe were in the aftermath of World War II. You're not looking at a Germany which is going to be, crossing the Atlantic and invading any more than, what's that movie? Red Dawn was ever likely going to happen. Yeah, like Soviet paratroopers landing in Kansas or something.
In Colorado.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, right. Yeah. So, like SS Panzer divisions landing on
hey guys,
on Jersey Shore,
well, nobody wants to go there.
Well, yeah, even the Germans,
they'd be like, we out.
Yeah, exactly. So instead of landing on, I don't know, Martha's Vineyard, instead of dropping 50 SS Panzer divisions on Martha's Vineyard, it would be about as likely as Russian paratroopers in Colorado. Right? This is not something which is going to happen. And again, I mean, you mentioned like nukes. Again, the United States is massively far ahead in nuclear technology, computer technology.
Although one of my favorite musings is all the technology of the Nazis and how they came about their technology, which there's various theories, but I'm obviously going to be more so realistic with it than just saying aliens.
Aliens.
But they obviously, well, you could say they did have some otherworldly influences with that. But as far as their research goes, there was a whole reason why the United States had the OSS division developed because of all of the well, I don't want to say opposite kind of manifestations for what Germany was developing, but they were certainly developing very technologically advanced weaponry before the United States could get their hands on it, like jet propulsion, heavy water with the hydrogen bomb, and they were musing in their own territory when it came to the resources that they had available to develop advanced weaponry and technology.
Yeah, probably the one thing they were most advanced in was the ballistic rocketry. Which is of course why Russia and the United States both borrowed so heavily from von Braun and his team in Operation Paperclip and all that stuff
Paperclip.
for
Woo,
the
woo,
space race.
woo.
Yeah, yeah. But by and
That's
large,
actually I you know what I would say probably one of the most materialistic arguments you can make for this is Operation Paperclip because on its surface you did have the literal pragmatic aspects of war and the development of the technology that came out of it. I don't know what could possibly be more materialistic of a pragmatic argument than such as that. Because see the thing of this is I don't want to touch the subject too hard on this. But obviously, you had the psychological trials during the you know what, and this is how a lot of modern psychology was developed too. As sick as that sounds, as crazy as that sounds, they literally did experiments on people, and people on the dissident right want to cover stuff like that up and say, "Oh well, this is just a myth." No, the source material literally comes from Nazi concentration camps, and it's like you can't cover that kind of stuff up. So how do they get these results? How do they run these tests on unwilling victims, pretty much? But how do they get these results? How do they push human psychology this far to get to the point where this was quote unquote clinically tested? Like this just didn't manifest out of some kind of cockamamie scheme that some psychologist or malpracticed psychologist came up with. This literally came out of very brutal circumstances.
yeah. Well, so I mean, I want to kind of go back to this sort of Cold War scenario here. So, and just kind of like think about what the consequences of this would be. Um, so what you'd end up with is this sort of standoff across the Atlantic between
Mm-hmm.
and across the English Channel, I would contend, because I don't think that
Britain wouldn't
you.
kowtow down to that. Britain
Yeah,
doesn't.
I mean, they might peace out, but you're not going to see a Nazi-controlled Britain.
Yeah, because Britons are like the Greeks in that aspect. Like they feel like they're. It's kind of weird because of how the Anglo mindset and the Hellenic mindset are very similar in those aspects. Like they consider themselves to be European, quote unquote, but they're not necessarily like European. Like they're not that traditional. There's not in that like highly traditional centralized
Yeah,
sense.
and I wouldn't even look at it from like a motives perspective. I would just look at it purely from a means perspective. And the
Okay.
means perspective is that Britain had the resources to keep Germany at bay all day,
Mm-hmm.
even once they've taken over Western Russia, theoretically. They're still going to have to build up resources for a invasion of Britain. The United States is not going to let that happen. They will pour resources into Britain to keep Britain from falling. Um, from a German invasion succeeding, especially after Russia's been taken out. At that point, it's looking quite bad for from an American perspective. Like it's this sort of encroaching. threat across the Atlantic, much like the Soviets were in the aftermath of World War II. Much from the US's own doing, of course. I will be the first to make that point, is that the US certainly empowered the monster and FDR and all these sort of Harry Dexter White and all the other people in his administration who had very strong sympathies toward the Soviet Union created that monster in the process of World War II. Um, but if you'd ended up in this situation, you would have had this confrontation in the Atlantic, much the same as what you ended up with after World War II with the Soviets, thanks to U.S. How they went about assisting the Soviets and over assisting the Soviets against Germany. But what would this have meant for sort of like the ideological and political developments of the United States? I think it's interesting to think about for these people, at least in the United States, who signal about, we're on the wrong side or something.
Yeah.
Because what would you have had then? Like, think about how the Cold War worked in the United States, right? The United States was led by an elite in World War II that had a lot of communist sympathies, which was why they were so fervently eager to support the Soviet Union to the extent they did, and hand Stalin Eastern Europe on a platter and stuff like that. But even though that elite, was still there in the aftermath of World War II, this confrontation that ended up developing between communism and America led to this sort of social situation where being anti-communist in the United States was a good thing, right? That was sort of the mainstream popular culture, was opposed to communism. And the government, even to the extent that you had people in the government who were sympathetic to communism, had to, for pragmatic reasons, kind of put up this anti-communist front. And you got things out of that were good. Things out of it that were not so good, I think a lot of people would point to, but you at least had a force that kind of pushed in a Newtonian way, a sort of equal and opposite way, right? If you had this left-wing communist force that's your great geopolitical rival, you have to kind of signal the opposite, right? Just how in Europe, when you had the confrontation between Britain and France in the 1700s, you had it was sort of framed in like Catholic and Protestant terms, right?
Okay. Yep.
Even when parts.
Well, the Irish and the English, even.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or like in Ireland, the two sides in Ireland, it's framed.
Oh,
in like
well, yeah. Okay. Yep. Even break it down further.
Catholic and Protestant terms.
Even in England, Anglican, Protestant, and Catholic.
Exactly. So I would contend that although that, that I'm not saying it was an unalloyed good, I think that Newtonian push in that direction could be viewed as a good thing, or at least better than a potential alternative. Because let's ask ourselves now, like, if we replace that Cold War rivalry with the Soviet Union in our hypothetical scenario, where the quote unquote good guys or right side or whatever your meme wants to call them won in World War II, and let's even grant that you're correct on that, right? I'm going to say let's take the value judgment out of this
for the sake of
say that these are the good guys, whatever, and that they won, right? But now, instead of this communist rival, what do you have as the great rival of the United States in Europe? In this Cold War scenario, you have a very virulently right-wing, at least presented itself as such, fascist, very racialized government. So now what is the political, ideological propaganda environment
Well,
of the United States and the United
yeah.
States government going to look like, both from a domestic perspective on these are our foes, and from a foreign policy perspective of like, we are the alternative to these people. What does that look like? Who are you signaling against now? Now you're not signaling against communists. Let's say that you are a national socialist in the United States,
Hmm.
and that you really, and that, you're really on board with all that stuff. Do you actually want them to win in Europe? Because now you have a United States which already the elite was extremely predisposed to be unfriendly to that
Hmm.
ideology, right? They were already very biased against it and
Yeah.
friendly to communism. Now you're going to embark on a decades long propaganda fueled Cold War where that elite that is very predisposed against your favorite ideology is
Completely against communism.
right, but it's not against communism anymore. Now it's against Nazism and
Yeah.
fascism, and
Yeah.
now it's not. And now you've got the red-blooded patriotic Americans checking for Nazis under their beds
Yeah.
instead of
Yeah.
commies, and the people, in the backwoods of America who are complaining about those commies and those, now they're complaining about those Nazis.
Right.
Is that good? Is that a good thing for like your ideology? It doesn't. So I guess my point is like this signaling that comes out about, oh, the wrong side won or whatever. When you actually like think about rationally what sort of situation you actually would have ended up with, is completely counterproductive to people who think this is their pet ideology in the first place, right?
Hmm.
If you
I
can
got
remove all value judgments from it, all questions of morality or historical events and atrocities and all that stuff, just ignore it all and say, okay, say this is what you're on board with, whatever. Um, does this actually play out how you think it does? Like, or are you basically just you're playing like, I don't know, in your head you're playing Hearts of Iron or something. You're like, oh yeah, I can do a world conquest with Germany. It's like so therefore this means they they would conquer the world or something. It's video game thinking basically is what
Yeah,
it
and
is.
it would just become an ill adopted, ill adaptive system just as much as communism did, just as much as like what you said earlier with fascism adopting, just or I'm sorry, with Italian fascism and having the king, as its kind of figurehead, but still like there's still recognition of like a monarchy, and see that's just it. So there's stagnation, and then there's stagnation again. Like there's two competing forces in something like, well, I mean, you could say Italian fascism in a way competed with the monarchy in Italy because, well, and then on top of this you had the Vatican and the Catholic Church. So you had basically all three of those proponents of power in competition with one another, and clearly in that mode of governance the church was over the state or is over the state for sure. Like there's no ifs ands buts about that. But when you have it flipped on its head, when it comes to Nazism versus Bolshevism, and you see that there is a well there's definitely a pragmatic dialectic to this. There would have been just as much of a stagnation because both are, as far as I'm concerned, completely void of any kind of religion, and the state literally becomes that replaced religion. It becomes, and so from then on, you would either have racialized socialism, which is in turn a form of communism, or just flat out de-racinated Bolshevism, which in a lot of regards is not really, if you think about it, it's not really, it's more so ethnically minded, right? it's not so much deracinated as many people like to make that argument, and I don't think that's the proper way to frame it. I would go more so towards ideology and ethnicity when you want to make the communist argument, because there's definitely more ethnic cleansing that happens when those kind of things come about than there are almost any point in history. Like, I know the popular meme is to say, well, things would be different if somebody else would have, if the tide of the war turned, and that's totally not the case. But I would never frame the scenario like you did with that one.
Yeah. So I mean, and I would agree that in the long term, either way, in this hypothetical um, Nazi versus U.S. Cold War situation, you would see the U.S. come out on top in the end for much the same reasons you did with the Soviet Union um, collapsing, stagnation. And you can view that as like you can make the arguments about economics and um, you can make the arguments about economics and ideology and that sort of stuff and how that would play out. Um, or you could just view it as like a land power, sea power type situation, right? The
Well,
sea power
yeah,
would come out on top um, through containment, much as the way that the United States did with
yeah,
the Soviet Union. Yeah. So, and also the Germany would have, as the Nazi Germany would have had all sorts of weaknesses that the Soviets probably wouldn't have had right off the bat, like a more hostile United States for one thing, because of the ideological predispositions of the American elite. Whereas it took like a good decade. It took until the Korean War really for the United States to start taking the communist threat seriously. At least in the upper echelons of the government, and a lot of the common people too, because they've been fed a propaganda line about Uncle Joe, our good friend Uncle Joe Stalin. He's such a good guy. Hook you up, all throughout World War II, to make it more palatable to fight on the side of a democidal regime of
yeah.
the monstrosity of Stalin, right? Um, and then like what sort of third world appeal could Nazi Germany have had in a Cold War confrontation? So I think they would have had some advantages over the Soviets, just with their, I guess, their um, capital base in Germany and the fact that they hadn't quite purged out like all the productive people in their society in the same way that the
Whoops.
Soviet Union had.
Yeah.
Yeah, not a recipe for success. So they would have had those advantages. But right, you're sort of setting up this situation where um, you could end up in a situation that's much worse than what we even had in the latter half of the 20th century as it played out, because you don't have that sort of push
Yeah.
in a direction. You don't have, especially if you have something where um, well, I guess one other thing I would say about it is, I kind of view it as all of these regimes were probably going to end up in similar places. People like to look at stuff now and say like, oh, if you could see, if a World War II veteran see whatever drag queen story hour, they would be like, oh, well, this wasn't worth fighting, or we were on
Well,
the wrong side or something.
why do they like to suppress the General Patton quotes? Right.
Right, right. Well, I think that I think it's pretty clear that you would have seen like all these regimes were developing like in much the same direction, which was a sort of like Brezhnevian sclerosis and
Oh
just
wow.
absolute uh, sort of hedonistic uni. Um,
Mm.
in the Soviet Union, you got that. They sort of had this sort of the late Soviet Union was this cascade of doddering, senile leadership, much as the U.S. is now just being destroyed by bureaucratic sclerosis. But they were just poor because communism, so they didn't have quite the same sort of propensity for hedonism, I guess, as in our case, right? But I think you would have definitely seen a Nazi Germany that lasted, another 60 years, say a regime that survived not just past World War II, but say a transition from Hitler to another regime. I don't see any reason why these were not fundamentally all that different regimes. They're all
Right. Yeah, they had still the same emphasis on basically the state.
right. Right. State centralization. They're all children of the Enlightenment, fundamentally. Um, in the case of Britain and the United States, I would say there was more emphasis on religion in Britain's case because it was to some extent the one of those countries that actually still had a sort of a throne and altar system of some sort, vestigial as it was operating.
Yeah. Much like, well, I mean, and if we're going to give the nod to the Chinese on that, the Chinese still pretty much have that as much as as much as communism has reared its ugly head in that country, they still have that divine right of kings kind of aspect to them just as much as the Brits do.
Well, yeah, I guess. Well, you're kind of talking about like the mandate of heaven.
Yeah.
Idea. Yep. Yeah, that's almost kind of like a political philosophy idea, I'd say at this point. Which it was kind of like it probably was sort of like a pseudo theological concept, like divine right of kings at one point. Yeah. But now I think it's more viewed as like a political philosophy concept, which it's a pretty good one, I'd say. This idea that
it's maintained an order.
Yeah, it's sort of like it's almost like if you're doing good, then you have a right to rule, sort of thing, right?
Which is kind of strange too, because of the overtly masculine overtones that obviously monarchy can have, and that blended with a ideological aspect of fascism. I mean, it does fit the bill. It does literally, coincide with what they're striving for. But yet at the same time, because of what you said, them being children of the Enlightenment, rather than any kind of, religious context, really, that political philosophy will implode right on its own.
Right. Yeah. So these were all states that were, Enlightenment states to one extent or the other. In the United States' case, it was tempered by the fact that the population was just so religious. You're talking about one of the most religious populations on earth, largely because of the way that the initial settlement of the United States happened was to a large extent driven by religious zealots, leaving their country. Mm-hmm. So that tempered, I'd say, the Enlightenment aspects that there were in the American system and always has, both in like a temperament perspective, a populist perspective, but also even in the codification of our form of government. But also they were all products more recently, I'm talking about Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, and the United States here, of Burnham's managerial revolution, which is this idea he talks about where, the communists had this idea of like a revolution of the proletariat against the bourgeoisie, mm-hmm. the workers against the capital owners. But he said, this didn't really happen anywhere, really, or in any lasting sense. The workers don't run anything, even in communist states, right? They're still just workers.
Yeah.
Yeah. What you had instead is this revolution that happened oh, to some extent simultaneously, but at different speeds.
Okay.
In the Soviet Union, in the United States, and I think Germany, Nazi Germany was another one of these states where you had the owners, capital owners, the bourgeoisie, replaced with managers.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the system that we have today, where things are run by managers, which is why Karen always asks to see the manager, not the capital owner. But anyways, and managers here means both, the way that corporations are run in the United States, as an example. The stockholders don't have much say over how public companies are run. No, it's the managers,
So
aka
yeah.
the CEOs, the executives. Those people are not, I mean, they have stock in the company, right? But they're not owners per
Mm-hmm.
se. And also, bureaucrats is like the main thing, right? And in the Soviet Union, bureaucrats were like literally, you know, acting as, businesses because
Right.
they had no private industry. But even here in the United States, I mean, especially now, but very much so in FDR's time period as well, this is kind of what the New Deal introduced. You had bureaucrats that were telling people how they could or could not use their capital. And Nazi Germany ran much the same way. It was not a um, it was not a society run by owners or capital owners. It
No.
was a society
Yeah.
run by managers, bureaucrats, which largely in Nazi Germany's case meant party officials. Or, in some of the larger corporations, you had things that were developing in the way that the US system has, as sort of like this private corporate bureaucracy, right? But I mean, largely here in the United States, this idea of like private industry is kind of like a misnomer or a myth. Like we don't really have private industry here anymore because so much is managed by the government through regulatory agencies and bureaucrats.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whether it's the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission or the EPA or OSHA or the Department of Labor
Yeah.
or whatever.
You have to get
Um,
through. Yeah, you have to get through the red tape.
exactly. And Nazi Germany was a
Red tape
very much a
society.
society of red tape. Exactly. So,
Overly more so heavily regulated than you could argue than the United States
yeah,
because of all the centralization and central planning that came out of the defiance of the Treaty of Versailles because of the Weimar Republic. But see, this is where your materialistic pragmatism picks up because people want to point to something like the prosperity post the Treaty of Versailles, but not really, not really getting away from that because of how much they were in quote unquote defiance of. And then they obviously want to point the finger at who. But the issue here is that okay, I mean there's been many points in history where many societies and many countries have just said, well, we don't need this treaty. We can be productive on our own. We can make, well, in a lot of ways, have a very American mentality with that, make our own way. We can do this on our own. We can have a very capitalistic attitude. We don't need the oligarchs to centralize or run this for us. And the flip side of this is that in a very unique sense when it happened to Germany is that not only number one they didn't have enough resources, number two they had a very real capitalist problem. They didn't have enough money. And the problem with this is that they had to develop those engines of war in order to loot capital. And the problem is that this is where that all of that if it was so different on the other side, argument starts to break down because of the utilization, or maybe I should say the problem of the mismanagement of resources and capital. because they would have never needed to, they would have never have gone to war if that was the case.
Right. This is like the argument that tankies like to make about, or not even tankies, but like misinformed people in the United States. You know, um, lefties, but not just lefties, even just like general common knowledge people will make about Stalin, right? They'll be like, "Oh, he was bad, but at least he industrialized Russia," you know, and that.
I mean, he did. He
Yeah,
did.
yeah. But
Go ahead.
the thing is, he industrialized Russia after the Bolsheviks had deindustrialized Russia
Yeah.
during the Russian Civil War. Like, Russia was industrialized in the Tsarist period. It had been rapidly industrializing in the lead up to World War One. And then the Bolsheviks destroyed 90% of the capital stock of the country. Uh, so Stalin was just undoing, some of the damage that had been done by him and his compatriots in the previous decade. So, like, to give them credit, it's like, if you like, your kid comes in and like punches holes in your drywall or something, and then they patch over it badly, and then like sort of half-heartedly paint it, and you're like, oh well, at least they painted the wall. Well, like, yeah, because they doggone punched a bunch of holes in it, to begin with, and now it looks awfully shoddy. Oh yeah, and by the way, like 10 million people died.
Oops.
So,
Oops.
yeah,
Kind of dropped the ball.
yeah, that's the argument that people make. So the
But
the if
on the
if
flip
it had
side,
been
yeah. Yeah.
well, if it had just been done by market forces, you would have seen like way more efficient capital allocation.
The market would have corrected itself. The old adage.
Well, yeah, or you wouldn't have had all these super inefficient factory setups that the Soviet ended up with, and which led to so much of their stagnation, in the second half of the 20th century, with their overemphasis on heavy industry and stuff like that. Like, they were just completely just annihilated, just left behind in like the microcomputing revolution, because they had no industrial or research development or manufacturing capability that was really able to take advantage of that, because everything was invested in stuff like heavy industry, because it was all centrally planned. There was not the flexibility that the market had to keep up with these new innovations, and so they were just left in the dust.
Yeah. Yeah. Which does turn into the good old adage of the American shopping mall, and how, on how even that has kind of been a microcosm of an economic revolution. Like, you can say on one hand, oh, people are lazy, they just go on a certain website or Amazon or whatever, and all they have to do is click and point, or point and click rather, and get something dropped off at their front door.
Right?
Well,
You might
is
get the wrong
that
thing.
yeah, well, you might get the wrong thing. I mean, that's a pain. That's a pain in the what. But is that moving from the bulky centralized retail space that those companies had to pay for, and or a mom and pop shop had to put up rent, and let's say that landlord is a tyrant, or let's say the landlord is completely awesome. It could go either way, right? And they literally have to run a business, but from the get go, can they run an effective business? Now, could somebody eventually go online, create an online store, be online, and get their presence built, and then eventually become a mom and pop shop, right? Like, they're like, see, and this is where people don't think like, oh well, there's the de-evolution to it in a way. Well, now this is becoming dehumanized, and this is going to be run by technocratic elites. Or on the flip side, could you just say like, well, I know, there's a lot of that woke nonsense with some of this stuff, but you could say, Well, let's say an entrepreneur who's happens to be from a ghetto, or somebody is like a quote unquote minority, or what have you, right? Well, let's say they have a great business idea and their business idea gets viral. You mean to tell me that that isn't some kind of step in the right direction, where they're literally utilizing the tools that are given to them on a free market basis? Boom. There's the pragmatism right there. They've just built themselves wealth and an empire based on their great idea.
Well, and that's a really critical point, that like the woke stuff, it's pushed into industry the same exact way that Nazi ideology was pushed into private industry in Nazi
Correct.
Germany. It was
Yep.
done through state institutions. Um, and in Germany's case, they had this sort of parallel state party system, whereas here in the United States, like the party is much more like deeply integrated into the state, and into the bureaucracy much more directly. But it's the same basic thing, right? Like this is coming from the Department of Justice, from
Hmm.
civil rights law, from the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission,
Yeah.
Department of Labor, all this stuff. So it's pushed by state power. Like without state power, you would not see nearly as much of this stuff. And of course, it's kind of a feedback loop, right? Because people are conditioned by state power and by state propaganda. So you get this feedback loop where people are conditioned by this application of central state power, and then they demand more of it. Right?
Two
And
minutes of hate.
well, yeah, they come to believe the propaganda, and so then they ask for more of it, and it's a self-perpetuating cycle at that point, which does seem to largely be where we are. But yeah,
It's a weird, and it's completely, it's the see, the weird part about this is it's the completely opposite pragmatic feedback. Well, it's a feedback loop, but it's a feedback loop of just basically almost entirely that mirrors that of a drug addict. You're trying to do the right thing and you want that dopamine hit. While I post about this nonsense about some backwoods, something or other Christian that said something online, and how insensitive it was. But now I'm getting hits on TikTok or whatever the hell they use, and I need these dopamine hits because of how now I'm showing off to all my friends on how self-righteous I am at the same time, and I'm like, you're just replacing one kind of like religious aspect for another kind of religious aspect, quote unquote. It's kind of like swapping out literally ideology. It's kind of swapping out religion for an ideology, really. But what's happening is that like you're insurmountably doing almost the same exact thing as that person that you disagree with. So now the weird part about that is it becomes a feedback loop of, well, it's a dichotomy, really, or a paradox, whichever one anybody prefers. But it becomes that feedback loop, and now there's literally stagnation and no pragmatism. Like there's literally it's completely void of that because of how retardedly redundant it becomes and how ineffectual it all is.
yep, yep. Well, anyhow, I think probably covered plenty for tonight. I mean, we may definitely want to go into a round two or a part two at some point, but I don't know. What do you think?
I think a part two sounds great, and yeah, I mean, I appreciate you coming on.
All right, yeah. No, thank you for having me. It was fun to talk about. I know I'd wanted to just send you a blurb or something at one point with this kind of laid out, but just the more I was thinking about it, the more and more sort of context and layers it seemed to have. So it was probably good to to sort of knock into it, and then a bunch of other tangential stuff on this format.
Well, yeah, of course. It's much easier, it's way easier to work a thesis out via speech.
Yeah.
All right.
All righty, sir. Well, thank you, and you have a good evening.
You as well. Bye bye now.
Bye.